Hi, today we're going to be talking about major scales and key signatures. This is LHSBandRoom, and I'm Bob Seay. A scale is a prearranged pattern of notes that starts on one note and usually ends 8 notes above at the octave, and then it begins to repeat. Most people only recognize one or two of these patterns, the patterns that we know as the major and minor scales. However, there are actually many different types of scales that we use in music. We'll get to those in another video. Before we talk about scales, we need to introduce the idea of intervals. An interval is a space between notes. Are the intervals close together? Are they farther apart? Could be an octave apart, or anywhere in between. A half step, sometimes called a semitone, is the smallest interval we have in Western music. The chromatic scale is nothing but half steps. Half steps are sometimes called semitones, which literally means half a tone. The name refers to the interval between the pitches. It goes from C to C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F sharp, G, G sharp, A sharp, B, and C. 12 half steps. That's a chromatic scale. Like I said, if you ask someone to play or sing a scale, the chances are pretty good they will sing a major scale. So let's start there. Remember how I said that scales are prearranged patterns of notes? More specifically, a scale is a specific arrangement of whole step and half step intervals. Here's an image of what that looks like. You can see the half steps and the whole steps. The whole steps are twice as big as the half steps. This is the pattern for a major scale. A half step is any two adjacent keys on the piano. That includes black keys. So if I'm on C, then the next key is C sharp. That's a half step from C to C sharp. If we go up another half step, we get D. From C sharp to D is a half step. D is 2 half steps above C. Remember, 2 half steps equal 1 whole step. There is no black key between E and F. That's because from E to F is just a half step. Same thing with B to C. Let's start with a C major scale. C is a good place to start because the C scale uses no sharps or flats. On the piano, there are no black keys in the C major scale. The pattern for a major scale goes like this. A whole step, half step. Notice there is no black key between E and F. That's because those notes are only 1 half step apart. Whole step, half step. Just like before, there is no black key between B and C. So the pattern for a major scale is whole step, half step, whole step, half step. Notice how the scale starts and ends on the same note? That's rule 1. All scales start and end on the same note. After that, they just repeat. That works great as long as every song is in the key of C, but what happens when we move to another key? Suppose we want a major scale, but we wanted to start on D instead of C. We use the same pattern, but instead of starting on C, we would start on D. So the first note is D. The second note is E. We need a whole step. D to E is a whole step. The third note's a little more complicated. If we just go up the keyboard, we hit F natural. And that doesn't sound like a major scale. In fact, that's what a minor scale sounds like. We'll cover minor scales in another video. To keep the pattern, we need a note that's a whole step above E. That would be F sharp. F sharp is a whole step above E. Remember, a whole step is made up of 2 half steps. From E to F is a half step. Then from F on to F sharp is another half step. That gives us the whole step that we need for the pattern. So we have D, E, F sharp. Now the pattern calls for a half step. 1 half step above F sharp is G. D, E, F sharp, G. Whole step, half step, whole step. After that is another whole step from G to A, then another whole step from A to B, then another whole step. But just like before, there is no black key between B and C. From B to C is a half step. The pattern calls for a whole step. Just like before, we have to use a sharp, and we raise that C to a C sharp. From B to C is a half step. From C to C sharp is a half step. Together, that's the whole step that we need for this pattern. So here's the major scale that starts on D. D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, D. Whole step, half step, whole step, half step. Let's look at flat keys. Bands love flat keys, so let's see how a major scale looks in B flat. start on B flat. The pattern calls for a whole step, so the next step up, the next note up is C. That's a whole step above B flat. B flat to B natural is a half step, and another half step up is C. We need another whole step, so C to D. Next is a half step, so D to E flat. Then a whole step, E flat to F. There is no black key between E and F. That's because from E to F is just a half step. Same thing with B to C. F to G is another whole step, then G to A. Now we need a half step to complete the pattern, and a half step above A is B flat. When we say a song is in the key of G or a song is in the key of D or whatever, what we mean is that the song centers around that sound. In other words, that is the scale that we use to create the song. Think of it like a word bank on a history quiz, the kind where your teacher would give you a set of words that you were supposed to use. You're supposed to choose the word that best answers the question. A scale is your word bank. In the key of B flat, you can choose any of these notes. That looks pretty cluttered, so instead of putting in all those accidentals, composers use key signatures. This key signature tells us that every B is going to be played B flat and every E is going to be E flat. Sharp keys work the same way. In this song, every F is F sharp, every C is C sharp, and every G is G sharp. This would also look pretty cluttered. Instead of using all those accidentals, we'll just use the key signature to tell us what's going on. So how do you write a scale or play one on your instrument? You can do this on paper or you could do it in your head. If you're new at this, you might want to write it on paper so you can see what's going on. Step 1. Write or think the first note and last note of the scale. Remember, all scales must start and end on the same note, one octave apart. After that, they just repeat the same pattern. Step 2. Write the notes in between. Step 3. Use the major scale pattern to make the notes fit the pattern. Whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Step 4. Repeat the pattern for additional octaves. To summarize, all scales start and end on the same note, one octave apart. All major scales use the same pattern of whole steps and half steps. Whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. Number 3, sharps and flats are used to make the notes fit this pattern. And finally, number 4, key signatures tell you which notes will need a sharp or need a flat to fit the key.